Sometimes, instincts are all you have. That's what led me to leave my business trip a day early. Everything had been routine, yet an uneasy feeling settled over me as I lay in my hotel bed that night. Something tugged at me, urging me to return home. I couldn't explain it, but I followed it anyway. When I arrived, the lights were on, and laughter floated through the house. I walked through the front door, expecting Kate to be surprised but glad to see me. Instead, I found her in the living room, drinking wine with Mike, my best friend, and Sarah, our daughter. The scene was casual enough, until I saw the expressions they quickly tried to mask. Their laughter halted mid-sentence, and Kate's eyes flickered with an emotion that wasn't relief or happiness, it was shock. It was guilt. "Hey, you're back early," she stammered, forcing a smile. Sarah looked up and gave a brief, almost distracted hug, her attention returning to Mike and Kate with a familiarity that struck me as strange. Mike, too, seemed uncomfortable, though he quickly masked it with a casual grin and raised his glass. "Surprise, huh?" he chuckled, giving a little shrug. "Guess you missed our little wine night." I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling. "Yeah, seems like I did." The rest of the evening felt like a slow torture. Kate was tense, her smile never quite reaching her eyes, and Sarah seemed unusually supportive of Mike's presence, almost protective of him in a way that made my stomach turn. I tried to brush it off as paranoia, but the air was thick with something unspoken. That night, lying beside Kate, I couldn't shake the unease. She'd been more distant lately, and I'd been blind, chalking it up to routine, to the ebb and flow of marriage. But as I lay there, watching the faint glow of her phone screen as she texted someone late into the night, I felt a surge of suspicion. "Who are you texting?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She quickly turned off her phone, giving me a dismissive shrug. "Just Sarah." She had a question about her schedule tomorrow. But her voice had that same forced quality from earlier. I closed my eyes, pretending to fall asleep, while my mind raced through fragments of conversations, glances, and late-night texts. I'd seen enough signs to know something was wrong, but I hadn't wanted to believe it. The next morning, the suspicion had only grown. Over breakfast, I observed how Kate and Sarah shared knowing looks, how they'd laugh at things unsaid, little inside jokes that seemed to exclude me. And when I mentioned Mike's name, they exchanged a glance so quick that they probably thought I wouldn't notice. "Anything going on with Mike?" I asked, testing the waters. Kate's face remained impassive. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "Just curious. He seems to be around a lot." She laughed, the sound hollow. "You're imagining things." But I wasn't imagining anything. I'd caught a glimpse of something real last night, something hidden beneath the surface. And as I watched them that morning, each smile and whispered word seemed to fit together, forming an ugly, unmistakable truth. This wasn't paranoia. This was betrayal, and I was just beginning to see the edges of it. Suspicion was a relentless companion, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts with a persistence I couldn't ignore. That night, as I lay awake next to Kate, I made a decision. I would follow her. I needed to know if the shadows in my mind were real or just paranoia. If I was wrong, then I could let it go. But if I was right, well, I wasn't sure what I would do, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the dark. The opportunity came 2 days later when Kate left the house, claiming she needed to pick up a few things. Her tone was casual, and she offered no details, which only fueled my suspicion. I waited a few minutes, then grabbed my keys and slipped out, following her car from a safe distance. She drove across town, weaving through side streets before stopping in front of a small, dimly lit cafe. My pulse quickened as I pulled over, parking discreetly a few yards away. I watched her step out of the car and glance around, her face tense, almost nervous. I held my breath, watching her every move. Then I saw him. Mike emerged from the cafe, looking just as wary as she did. They exchanged quick words, and as I watched, Kate reached out, touching his arm in a way that felt far too intimate, too familiar. My best friend and my wife, locked in a moment I shouldn't be seeing. A cold realization settled over me. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. This was real, unfolding right before my eyes. All the late nights, the hushed conversations, the strange looks, they all pointed to this moment. The anger burned, sharp and deep, but the pain cut even deeper. I couldn't bear to watch any longer. I started the car and drove away, hands clenched on the wheel, my mind spiraling. Back at home, I tried to piece it all together, my thoughts looping over every interaction I'd seen, every detail I'd missed. But there was something that gnawed me even more: Sarah. Our daughter, our only child. She'd been acting strange, too, almost as though she knew about the affair, and maybe even supported it. Her loyalty to Kate and Mike, her dismissive attitude toward me, was she part of this web of deceit? The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My daughter, the one person I thought I could trust, the one I'd spent my life providing for and protecting, might have known about this betrayal all along. Maybe she was even helping them cover it up. I felt the betrayal as a physical weight bearing down on my chest. My family, my whole world, had turned against me. Kate, who I'd trusted with my life, and Mike, who I'd trusted with my friendship, had betrayed me. And my own daughter seemed to be complicit. But I didn't confront them. I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I decided on a different course of action. They thought they were so clever, hiding everything in plain sight. But I would be the one to surprise them. I would leave, disappear from their lives as completely as they'd betrayed me. Let them face the consequences of their choices, alone. And so, as the sun rose that morning, I knew what I had to do. In the early morning quiet, my plan began to take shape. I wouldn't confront them. That would be too simple, too easy for them to wriggle out of with lies and excuses. No, I wanted them to feel what I had felt, to be blindsided, to have the foundation of their lives shattered without warning. I wanted them to understand the devastation of being left with nothing. To vanish without a trace, I had to be methodical, meticulous. I began with the bank accounts, moving funds into a separate account under a new alias, slowly and carefully so Kate wouldn't notice the missing amounts. I'd always been the one managing our finances, so she rarely looked at the bank statements. This was my advantage, and I used it to ensure I would leave her with only the remnants of what she'd so casually disregarded. I closed my personal accounts, canceled my phone line, and started looking into places where no one would find me. It wasn't easy, but I felt strangely empowered as I made these preparations. Each step felt like taking back control, reclaiming something they had stolen from me. They thought I was in the dark, but I was the one with the upper hand now. I also started organizing my belongings, taking only what I needed, a few essentials, documents, and sentimental items they would never think twice about. I left the rest behind, wanting to sever ties with every material piece of the life they'd destroyed. I'd spent my whole life building a home with Kate, creating memories with Sarah, and sharing moments with Mike. Now, I was erasing myself from that picture, turning everything I'd once cherished into distant, empty memories. Days passed in quiet planning. Kate and Sarah went about their routines, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to hit them. At times, it felt surreal, watching them laugh and chat as though everything was normal. Kate would occasionally ask about my sudden interest in staying home, and I'd brush it off with a simple excuse. Sarah remained distant, treating me as though I were just an afterthought. Once, as I sat on the porch with a coffee, I overheard Kate talking on the phone with Mike. She spoke in hushed tones, her words laced with excitement, as though she was planning a life I had no part in. It confirmed what I already knew, but the sting was fresh, sharp as ever. They were moving forward, building something behind my back. But what they didn't know was that I was already a step ahead. There were moments when my resolve faltered. This was the family I'd dedicated my life to, the people I thought would always be there. But as I looked around at the faces I could no longer trust, the pain hardened into a determination I couldn't ignore. They had made their choices, and I was making mine. On the eve of my planned departure, I felt an eerie calm settle over me. All my preparations were complete. My new life was ready, waiting for me just beyond the walls of the home I'd soon leave behind. I lay awake in bed that night, listening to Kate's soft breathing beside me, wondering if she had any inkling of what was coming. The thought almost made me smile. In the morning, I would be gone. I would leave without a trace, without a single word of explanation, just as they'd left me with nothing but doubt and suspicion. They would wake up to an empty home, a life suddenly turned upside down, and they would know that they'd pushed me to this. As dawn began to break, casting soft light across the room, I rose quietly, gathered my things, and walked out the door, leaving behind a life built on lies. The cool morning air greeted me as I stepped outside, my bags packed and plans in place. I took one last look at the house, the home I had poured years of my life into, now feeling as foreign and empty as the people I was leaving behind. In the early light, it looked almost peaceful. But I knew that behind those walls lay a storm waiting to erupt. They'd wake up to an empty bed, to questions they'd never have answers for. And that, somehow, was satisfying. I slipped into my car, careful not to make any noise. The world felt different as I drove away, each mile adding a layer of distance between me and the betrayal I was leaving behind. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The weight of suspicion, heartbreak, and anger was slowly lifting, replaced by a quiet, steely resolve. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew it would be a life untainted by lies and deceit. I'd planned meticulously, and everything had gone smoothly. I took a long, winding route to my new destination, stopping only for gas, food, and to switch out my phone and identification at intervals. I'd secured a modest place in a quiet town, miles from everything and everyone I'd ever known. No one would think to look for me there. When I arrived, the small, nondescript house I'd rented looked welcoming. It was nothing like the home I'd left behind, but that was precisely the point. This was a blank slate, a fresh start where I could rebuild a life free from the lies that had poisoned my old one. I unpacked slowly, each step feeling like I was shedding the last fragments of my past. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted to the quiet. It was almost too quiet at times, but I took solace in the knowledge that I had taken control of my life, my choices. I left no trace, no emails, no forwarding address, no credit cards linked to my name. I was invisible, a ghost to Kate and Sarah, and that was exactly how I wanted it. The thought of them waking up that first morning without me brought a grim sense of satisfaction. I could almost picture their reactions, the shock, the confusion, the growing fear as they realized I was truly gone. I imagined Kate checking her phone, pacing the house, hoping to find some clue to where I'd gone. Sarah, too, would feel the weight of my absence, though likely for different reasons. They'd never know what happened or why I'd left. They'd live with the uncertainty, haunted by their own actions. Eventually, I reached out to a mutual friend under the guise of casual curiosity. Carefully keeping my anonymity, I learned about how things were unfolding back home. Kate was struggling, facing a series of financial issues without my steady hand on our accounts. Sarah was withdrawn, and Mike was conspicuously absent from the narrative, likely slipping away to avoid association with the fallout. They were all dealing with the repercussions of their choices, and in the knowledge of that, I felt a deep sense of vindication. I allowed myself a small, fleeting smile. They were tasting the bitterness they'd served me, left to sift through the ruins of the life they'd broken. And they had no one to blame but themselves. Each day brought a new sense of peace and distance. My new life was quiet, simple, and it was entirely my own. I found comfort in routines, in the small town where no one knew me or the baggage I'd left behind. And as time went on, the anger faded, replaced by a deeper understanding of who I was beyond the roles of husband, father, and friend. I had shed the life they had taken for granted, finding a freedom in my solitude that I'd never known. And as I closed that chapter, I realized I no longer needed their remorse, their guilt, or even their regrets. I had reclaimed my own life, and that was enough. In my new life, peace was something I was still getting used to. I was miles away, both physically and mentally, from the home I'd left behind. Yet every so often, would reach out to a trusted friend back in town, gathering small updates on Kate and Sarah. I never disclosed my whereabouts, and our conversations were always brief. But from those brief exchanges, I learned exactly what I'd hoped for: they were struggling. It was poetic, really. Kate had leaned on me for everything, from finances to household decisions, trusting that I would always be there to shoulder the weight. Now, without my support, she was floundering. The bills were piling up, and the comfortable lifestyle she had taken for granted was unraveling. Friends began noticing her distress, and though she tried to keep up appearances, her slip-ups were becoming more apparent by the day. My friend even mentioned that she'd been looking worn and frazzled, as though the strain of holding it all together was becoming too much. Sarah, too, was feeling the absence in ways Kate might not have expected. The initial shock of my disappearance had hit her hard, but over time, it had turned into resentment. She had gone from being supportive of her mother's choices to resenting her for the chaos that had erupted in my wake. Their bond, once close and unbreakable, was now tense and strained, with arguments becoming a common fixture in their household. As for Mike, he was nowhere to be found. The man who had once been my best friend, who'd seemed so confident in his role in Kate's life, had slipped away quietly, likely too cowardly to face the wreckage he'd helped create. He had left Kate and Sarah to fend for themselves, disappearing from the picture just as I had. Hearing about their struggles should have brought pain or anger, but I felt nothing but satisfaction. This was the justice I'd wanted, the consequence of their choices. They had torn my world apart, and now they were experiencing what it felt like to be left adrift, with nothing but each other's bitterness and regret for company. They were reaping what they'd sown. Over time, my friend told me, Kate had become increasingly desperate. She tried reaching out to mutual acquaintances, people who might know where I'd gone or have some clue about my sudden departure. But she always came up empty. The quiet, unanswered questions were haunting her. The people she approached grew tired of her constant inquiries, and she eventually stopped asking altogether, resigning herself to the unknown. One day, as I sat on my porch, watching the sunset over the trees, I allowed myself to reflect on what had happened. Kate's betrayal, Sarah's complicity, Mike's cowardice, it had all been devastating. But in the distance I'd created, I saw clearly now that their actions had nothing to do with me and everything to do with them. I was simply the collateral damage in their selfish choices. And that understanding gave me something I hadn't expected: release. They were suffering because of the life they'd chosen to lead, and for the first time, I could let go. I didn't need their pain to validate my decision to leave. I had already found peace on my own. That night, I slept soundly, knowing I had truly closed the door on my past. I didn't need to know every detail of Kate's struggle or every argument between her and Sarah. They were facing the world they'd shaped, a world without me. And as for me, I was ready to fully embrace the life I'd built from scratch. Months passed, and with each day, the life I'd left behind felt more like a distant memory, one I no longer felt bound to. My days had found a rhythm in this quiet town. I'd taken up new hobbies, made a few friends, and for the first time in years, I was getting to know myself beyond the roles I'd once played: husband, father, friend. I was discovering a new version of myself, unburdened and free. The solitude that had initially felt foreign now gave me a deep sense of comfort. I'd stopped asking about Kate, Sarah, and Mike. Whatever was left of my old life was now theirs to sort through, and I no longer felt any need to know how they were managing. They had their choices to live with, and I had my own choices to look forward to. It wasn't long before I met someone in town. Her name was Emily, a gentle, intelligent woman who shared my appreciation for the quiet life. We met in the most unassuming way, at a local bookstore, reaching for the same novel. We struck up a conversation, and over the next few weeks, she and I fell into an easy companionship. There was something refreshing about her presence, a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. Unlike my relationship with Kate, there were no undercurrents of tension, no secrets waiting in the shadows. With Emily, everything felt genuine. As we spent more time together, I began to feel something I hadn't expected: happiness. True, uncomplicated happiness. I could feel the scars of betrayal fading, replaced by a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. Emily brought out the best in me, and with her, I didn't have to look over my shoulder or wonder if there was something lurking beneath the surface. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset, she asked me about my past. I shared some of the story, the parts one felt were safe to tell, omitting names and leaving out the darkest details. She listened quietly, her hand resting gently on mine, offering silent understanding. In that moment, I realized I no longer felt anger or bitterness. Kate's betrayal and Sarah's complicity had once defined my world, but now they were just pieces of a past that no longer held any power over me. "I'm sorry you went through all of that," Emily said softly. "But I'm glad you found your way here." "Me too," I replied, feeling the weight of those words. I was truly glad, grateful even, for the path that had brought me to this moment. I hadn't seen it then, but losing everything had been a blessing in disguise. It had given me the chance to rebuild, to find someone who valued and respected me. In the months that followed, Emily and I grew closer, building a life together in the small town that had become my sanctuary. Each day felt like a gift, a second chance to live without the shadows of deceit. The thought of Kate, Sarah, and Mike faded further into the background, until they were barely a whisper in my memory. One day, I found myself reflecting on the journey from heartbreak to this newfound happiness. The man who had driven away from that house, full of anger and grief, had been reborn. I was no longer that man, defined by betrayal and loss. I had shed that life, choosing instead to live in the present, to embrace the freedom of moving forward. As Emily and I looked ahead to our future, I felt a deep sense of contentment, knowing I had left the past behind in every way that mattered. Kate, Sarah, and Mike would remain only as a chapter I'd closed, the memory of which no longer haunted me. I had my new beginning, my peace, and, most importantly, a future free from the lies that once held me captive. And with that, I was finally, truly happy. Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit the like button. It only takes a second, but it means the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on our upcoming videos. Something brand new is dropping tomorrow. And hit the notification bell to be among the first to see it. See you in the next video.